Hey, Greg here. This is my next installment of my on again, off again, it seems like series on advice for consulting. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of like the nuts and bolts. So, you've decided to do it and you have created your LLC, or at least went down that path and thought about it. And this one's probably going to be a little bit more all over the place, where I'm just going to have random thoughts. I got a few thoughts on my board here to the right. But I think that that's appropriate because when I first started independent, and I mean independent, and I was now done with my full-time job, I remember sitting and thinking, now what? What do I do? I mean, I had a couple of clients that I was working with through another organization, and I think I might have mentioned before, if I didn't, I think that that's a great way to start. That way you have a little bit of runway for your own consulting business. But I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know what a business plan was at the time. And I kind of was going out this sort of blind, and also very, very naive. I thought that if I put my shingle out there, proverbial shingle, for those of you who may not know what that reference is, back in the day, people would actually open up like a little business and they'd have a pole outside and they'd put a little wooden piece of something there, a little sign. It would look like a shingle from the house, and they would write their name and their business on it. They're still out there now. But I figured I'd put out my shingle, figuratively speaking, or virtually speaking, and people would just come running to me. I mean, what a great service. It's like, hey, virtual CISO, wow. It's like, I can really use your help. I didn't really understand why that wasn't exactly happening at first. And maybe if I'd had a business plan to begin with, or at least understood what a business plan was, had some goals, had some strategies. Now, fortunately, I did have a pretty good network at the time. I still do. I actually have a very good network. And people were offering me advice. And one person offered me this advice. She actually, her sister, I believe it was involved with helping small, mid-sized businesses as far as, I think it had to do with funding them or evaluating them or creating a understanding what their value actually was. And long story short, she made an introduction just for this person to help me, being so green, just with a couple of basic concepts. And one was to create a business plan and to think about, what are you going to charge? What are you going to charge for? How are you going to distribute this? If you're going to bring on employees, or you're going to bring on consultants, or all of that. And again, my fly by the night attitude was that, well, I just kind of figure it out as I went along. This gave me a little bit more structure as to understand, well, okay, what am I going to charge for a client? What is my time worth? What is the virtual CISO worth, the time? Because there's a difference there. And particularly as you continue to grow your business, you need to understand this, that what you charge a client if you're building a business is not the same as what you pay yourself. It's completely, because you have to have the plan to fund everything that's going on in your business, if you will, as an independent contractor. I think that some people don't realize this, even if they're just going to be by themselves and not bring on any help or have any serious infrastructure or anything like that. You're just a consultant out there. Well, let's first of all talk about taxes. This is the one that I think everybody gets surprised on, and including me, because I was like, wow, I can't believe that so much was taken out from taxes. Because when you're an employee, and I'm talking about from the state's perspective here, United States, your check, what you take home, your take home pay is not the same as your salary, and you get used to that. There's a certain percentage that's taken out for Social Security, for federal income tax. Sometimes there's state income tax. There could be workers' comp. There could be health insurance. All of that. None of that happens automatically when you're a consultant. Now let's do a little sidestep here and talk about health insurance, for example. As an employee, you're used to that, but you have to figure out if you want coverage, you have to figure out coverage for yourself. Now, one way to do it might be, well, if you have a spouse that you're dependent on, well, that's great. You could just continue to be on their coverage, and that's how a lot of folks will do it. Otherwise, you got to do one or two things: go out to the market and get your own coverage, and that can be very expensive, or roll the dice and don't have any coverage, and that's not a good idea either. But you got to build this into your plan. You have to understand that. And there's other elements there. Social Security. Yeah, you're going to be paying all of that. And you're going to be paying all of your federal taxes. You're going to be paying all your state taxes. But you're not paying all of this like every couple of weeks or every month it comes out of the paycheck. You have to, I believe this is the same for it has to be because it's federal. You have to file a quarterly estimate of taxes. You have to pay a quarterly estimate of taxes. The federal government's not going to give you a one-year loan on the taxes, your income taxes that you owe. And you better be able to figure this out pretty good, because if you're too far off, you're going to get fined. And you have to keep up on that. You have to keep up on quarterly payments and make sure that you're doing that. I may have talked about this in the last episode, but I'll talk about it here again. You need to think about insurance. The E&O, errors and omissions, professional liability. You might need to think about cyber insurance. Now, part of you might be thinking, well, I don't really need to do that because I'm not going to really be working with my client's information per se, not their client's information at least. Like, you're not going to be looking at patient data. Well, that doesn't matter because some clients may actually require you to have that. And now you got to think about that line as well too. Clients or prospective clients might expect you to have other things like the CISSP or similar professional certification, a degree, references. They might expect you to bring your own tools, for example. And that's certainly, obviously, they're not going to issue you a laptop as a consultant. They can't do that. And think about it also from the for example, from my perspective as both an employer now and as one who pays consultants, I can't provide things to consultants because that violates a lot of tax stuff. If you treat consultants too much, I mean 1099s, as an employee, guess what? The IRS will say they're an employee and you should be paying all these employment taxes and so on. If you bring on employees, that's a whole another story. You got to think about benefits. You got to think about workers' comp. You got to think about all the filings you have to do. And let's just talk about filings now for a moment with regards to setting up your business. I know I went through some of this with the LLC. For example, like in Tennessee, every year, I know this because I just did it, I have to file an annual report. And for the most part, nothing's free. The annual report in Tennessee for each one of the LLCs that I own two, is $300, okay? And that's just the cost of doing business. You have to build that into your plan. I have to file for property taxes, have to itemize occasionally. Sometimes in Tennessee, you could say that, well, all the stuff I have is less than $1,000. But what I found out, as far as like taxable assets, what I found out that if you do that for a few years, you may be subject for an audit. And as it turns out, my business is still so small that my tangible assets to property value is still something that falls below that line. But I have to keep track of those assets. And that takes time as well, too. You have to keep track of your assets of your company. And as your company grows or as your business grows, you're going to have to do more and more with regards to that. You have to think about how you're going to get your customers. Remember, you just throw out something there. It's like, you expect people to come. Well, even just throwing out something takes some resources and some time. You should definitely have a website. And if you have a website, you should have your own domain. My advice, don't have a professional business with a Gmail address. That just looks bad. And you want to be as competitive as you can be. Get your own domain, Get your own email address with that. The Microsoft Office suite or going with Google, none of that is going to be terribly expensive. But again, these are little things that you got to track to build into your cost of doing business so that you can understand when you charge somebody what percentage is actually going to the business, what percentage is going to you. You have to go through all of that just to get started. But then once you've got your website, what are you going to do? How are you going to get folks? How are you going to get clients? That's a secret sauce. That's a tough. I joke that marketing is a 4-letter word. And there's a lot of things that you can do, but I'll tell you from my experience, it all boils down to hustling and work. Creating content is sometimes good. Participating in social media works. Certainly blogging to an extent, going to conferences, offering to speak, getting your name out, and then networking with folks, letting them know that, hey, you're in the business of doing this. Join a networking group. The virtual CISOs have a couple of them themselves. But it's a lot of work. I mean, I spend, compared to when I started, not even now it's even worse because I'm basically running a business with several on staff. But when I started, I spent probably about 20% of my time on clients, 80% of my time on the business, of which that 80%, a big chunk of that was marketing. Figure out what you're good at and what you're not good at. One of the things I figured out when I was doing that was that I was horrible at cold calling. I tried it, and I figured I'd start with financial services and went out there and started calling, and after I might have done like maybe 10, and I realized this is just not for me. This is not going to work. And quite honestly too, the virtual CISO field is not conducive to cold calling. That just, if people realize that they need a virtual CISO, they'll look for it, because otherwise, if they don't realize they need it, they don't even know what a virtual CISO is. They've never stepped over that, and for the most part, in order to successfully land a client, they have to, at the very least, understood from the forefront what a virtual CISO is. They usually go out themselves and discover. It's like, oh, I didn't realize that was something that was actually out there. You got a lot of stuff that you might need to do as far as infrastructure support on your side. How are you going to track your prospects, for example? I used HubSpot, I think it was, for a while. How are you going to manage your social media presence? Are you going to have different areas on social media? Like for vCISO, very early on, I got a Facebook account, I got a Twitter account, LinkedIn, all either vCISO or vCISO services. I was fortunate at the time to be able to claim that, including on this channel, YouTube, where my handle is vCISO, I was fortunate with that. But you have to have that strategy. You have to put all that in place. And then how are you going to manage posting to that? Are you going to do everything individually, or are you going to try to use something like Hootsuite, for example, to help manage your social media posts? And what are you going to post? And you got to be careful about what you post too, because a lot of posts out there, and I'm sure that some of you can relate to this, you see it becomes noise. People post too much, or people post these long pontifications or whatever you want to call them on advice on how to do things, where it's just basically a long LinkedIn post that's not saying too much. It's more, if you read between the lines, it's, hey, look at me, I'm trying to be an influencer. And that doesn't really give the best business vibes in my opinion. So all these things you have to think about, and you have to, of course, track what you're doing. You have to invoice. So you got to figure out what platform you're going to use to invoice. What are you going to use for your accounts, making sure that you're tracking your AP and your AR, because you will have AP and AR functions. You're going to have cash coming in and cash going out. You're going to have to track all this, because at the end of the year, you better be able to provide really concise financials. And I think I mentioned before, and if I didn't, shame on me, you better have set up separate bank accounts. You want to keep your finances completely separate from your business finances, rather completely separate from your personal finances. So you need to do all of this. And this can be overwhelming. And so here comes the sort of big question. Why do you want to do this? If you want to become a consultant but don't want to worry about all of the other items about running a business, you can do that okay as a 1099, but what you're going to end up doing is that you're going to end up signing up with other organizations that actually do all that stuff that I just talked about. And so you're not going to be anywhere close to receiving the same rate that the client is paying because of all of that overhead involved. But on the flip side, you don't have to do any of the marketing. You don't have to do much of the billing and all that stuff as well. You'll just get your payment on a whatever cadence from the provider or providers you're working for. Because as an independent consultant, you can sign up with several MSPs. There's really nothing wrong with that. And so the plus there is that it is easier, but if you want to go the route of building your business, you got to be prepared for an awful lot more work. I'm going to turn and look at the board here for a second, make sure I didn't miss anything. I have up there government agencies. I talked a little bit about that as well too. There may be at some point in time, you may, if you want to work, like say for the federal government, there may be some agencies you need to register for there and those sorts of things. I guess the main thing that I wanted to do with this sort of random stream of consciousness discussion was just again to emphasize that there is just a lot behind doing this. Now, for me, I found that even though I never wanted to be an entrepreneur, I found that I really enjoy it. It's a lot of work, but I do enjoy it, and I've had to delve more into it. I've become somewhat of an HR expert, a payroll expert, an accounting expert, all these things that I've learned, and it's been pretty exciting the last few years. But understand that and reach out. Ask people questions. Ask me questions. I may not have exactly the right answer because I can really only speak from what I've done. And that's really the same for everyone. Nobody can tell you what to do and how to do it. They can give you ideas on how they've done it. It's the same thing as just like being in your cybersecurity career field, which is one of the reasons why I really enjoy doing the virtual CISO moment podcast, particularly the Tuesday episodes, because there's no one right way to navigate your career. But by hearing stories from different people, I think it promotes ideas in the head. It's like, oh, I never thought about doing something like that to promote my career. So I think I've talked enough today. And let me look at the board one more time. The next one I have on the board is mistakes that I've made and learned from. And maybe I'll do an episode on that. I certainly talked a little bit about cold calling because that was that was a mistake. I think the best thing you can do, though, is that, at least for me, this was just for me, what has always worked for me is what I've said many times before. If you have a heart of a servant, you'll always be successful because that's how you measure success. So until next time, and hopefully it won't be a few months, I'll try to do this a little bit more frequently, but I hope this has value. And if you have any questions, just ping me. Be happy to respond. Just in the comments below, I should be able to respond. Thanks.